webinar of the Canadian Water Resources Association. I'm Bob Halliday of the Saskatchewan branch of CWRA, and I will moderate today's session. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few things to ensure the webinar runs smoothly. The presentation will run for approximately 45 minutes and will be followed by a question and answer period. At any time, please type your comments or questions in the questions panel in the GoToWebinar control panel. All questions will be held and asked on your behalf at the end of the presentation. And I should point out as well that this webinar will be recorded and saved on our YouTube channel with members only access. If you'd like to get further information on CWRA webinars, by all means go to the CWRA website at cwra.org. It's my pleasure today to introduce Diogo Pinho de Costa. Diogo is a research scientist with Environment and Climate Change Canada, a fellow at the Centre for Hydrology, and a member of the Global Institute for Water Security at the University of Saskatchewan. Diogo's expertise is in mathematical modeling with a focus on the prediction of biogeochemical processes in cold regions. He holds a PhD in environmental modeling from the National University of Singapore through the ETH Zurich Research Centre based in Singapore, and he also has an MSc from Imperial College London. Between 2016 and early 2019, Diogo was a postdoc and later research scientist with the Centre for Hydrology and Global Water Futures program at the University of Saskatchewan. During this time, he led a combined experimental modeling program focused on supporting integrated water quality management in Canada through advances in monitoring and prediction and forecasting systems. He's continuing this work now with Environment Canada, and today he's going to share some of his achievements in this area. With this, I'd like to welcome Diogo and hand the presentation over to him. Welcome, Diogo.
Thank you, Robert. So it's a pleasure to be here. And as Rob said, I was a postdoc with John Pomeroy before joining Environment and Climate Change Canada in June. And so most of the work that I'll be presenting is really my postdoc work, and I've been continuing carrying that over to Environment Climate Change Canada. So the title is Support Integrated Water Quality, Quantity and Quality Management in Canada. And that is through trying to improve prediction and forecasting systems, as well as some monitoring tools that I've been working on. Okay. And I'll divide this presentation in three main sections, being the first one on trying to summarize state-of-the-art of modeling, of catchment nutrient modeling in cold regions, and then I'll provide an overview of my activities in general, and then that will then bridge into giving some examples on what those modeling tools and sampling technologies that I'm working on. So starting with the state-of-the-art of modeling hydrobiogeochemical processes in cold regions. This is a paper that just came out in environmental modeling software that we've been working on, trying to try to understand what the people have been doing. So what we did here was to analyze prominent popular nutrient catchment models, HPF, Inca, SWOT, and AN, AGNPS, and try to see where their hydrology is in terms of cold region. And what we found is that the critical cold regions processes, all of them take into account, like snowmelt, snow accumulation. Although the way these processes are represented varies considerably in terms of the method they use. And for example, again, snowmelt, you can see lots of blacks, and then you see white. So being the black physically based, it's basically the energy balance, no energy balance, and the white being the T-index method, for example. So things vary substantially within the model frameworks on how they represent this process. For example, wind distribution of snow that we all know it's critical in the prairie, for example, it's neglected in all models. So basically, the white squares, let's say, or sections, represent the missing processes in those models. Rain on snow, for example, is also highly neglected. And then you have a lot of problems with heavy calibration and whether you should move towards more physically based or more empirical framework. That will also depend on the state of science and the objectives. And so this is the hydrology, of highlighting some of the knowledge and modeling gaps. And now on top of that, we have the layer. So this is the first layer, the hydrology. Now we have the second layer that is way to the biogeochemistry. And we have, an increase in the complexity of the models and size. And then you start having problems with complexity, parsimony, how complex this model should be, model integrity, how closely mimicking the reality they should be, or could they be more abstract, and then problems related with structural identifiability. Being this the fact that you can have a model with hundreds of parameters or dozens of parameters, and if you calibrate that, you can end up with a number of combinations, parameter combinations that give you exactly the same model performance. And this means that then you don't really know which parameters you should put in which combination of parameters you should choose, and that represent the reality. So we have to bear in mind that these are virtual representations of reality, and that the uncertainty starts with how we conceptualize the models, how we discretize our model domains, the geological processes we choose, how we divide the nutrient pools, transformation pathways we consider. And this is just giving an example on how those models that I mentioned previously, how they do this. So for mineral, they always separate mineral from organic. That's a basic separation of the pools. But then they do things differently, being, let's say, Inca, the simplest model structure, which takes only organic components as sources, doesn't really model them as pools. And then you go on the other side of the spectrum, you have HSPF, which really goes into all the details. But for each of these pools, there are transformation pathways. So the number of parameters just increases exponentially as well. There has to be, a critical selection here on what is really what are the key processes we want to look at, and what is the question we want to answer. And that goes for both nitrogen and phosphorus. Okay, so based on all of these knowledge gaps and problems, structural problems related with how these models are developed. And I should say these are for process-based modeling of nutrient dynamics. So then I started conceptualizing a strategy to try to tackle some of these issues. So here's a summary of that. And so basically the central point is to try to have better integrated mathematical models for Canada. And what I mean integrated here, I'm referring to quantity and quality. And then I branch out into two types, and one is hydrologically based, and the other one is hydrodynamic based. And I'll explain why I make this separation. And then, so this is the central piece. And then I have two supporting thrusts here on the side. So one being the lab field experiments for process research and algorithm research. So trying to identify, let's say, blowing snow and really looking at that process, isolate the process, and try to develop better model algorithms, and then integrate those algorithms within this bigger or integrated mathematical model. So what we need to individualize, separate this particular process so we can have a better handle on the critical controls. And then some effort that I've been putting into improving sensing technologies for nutrient dynamics. and that is because we in water quality we tend to have a limited data sets, and so for modeling it becomes extremely difficult to validate the models. So recognizing that deficiency, I've also put some effort into trying to give some contributions into that. So starting with that, sensing technologies, this is an app that we developed under the Global Water Futures program and is mostly targeted to citizen science, and that is mainly because of the relative errors we are where we are at the moment. So we can get better than 30% at the moment. So the target is really for now citizen science, although our hope is to continue improving this. But this has been focused mostly on nitrates and phosphates, although this can be extended. And the idea is for on-farm instantaneous nutrient sampling. And this is based on commercially available cheap test kits. I'll give you some examples on how that works. But it's available in iOS and Android. We tested different light conditions. We really made a lot of tests for this, and we should be publishing this hopefully in early 2020. The results. But you can find this app in the Global Water Futures website. If you go here, I hope you can see the website. So if you go to GWF, you will find under resources, you'll find here model apps, and then you'll find the nutrient app, and we'll provide some details on all that on an overview, and then some highlights, how it works, and then you have an introduction video, a measurement procedure. So there are a specific protocol to get the best measurements possible, and then there's also a demonstration here, so you can follow and understand better the different steps. Okay, and so. Yeah, but basically you take these tests. We tested many instantaneous test kits available in the market, and we identify these two as being the most reliable. Basically, you dip for nitrate, you dip this test strip in water, the color changes, and then you take a photo of both the reference chart, the reference map in the back, and the test strip with the color, and then what the app will basically do is to interpolate the colors and provide a number instead of giving the only based on this ranges here that the color map provides. And after doing that, the app will give you a concentration, and this will immediately be populated in a map, and in a map that is inbuilt into the app. And you have the option to share this with us so we can keep improving our database. And then you can access that map and information through the website as well. Okay, so some examples now here on trying to improve the different algorithms. And I focused mostly on snow scale hydrogeochemistry modeling because I recognize that this is really a very neglected field within catchment nutrient models, and so I dedicated a lot of my time onto that. We know that snow accumulates chemicals during winter through wet and dry deposition, and it's been also observed that a high portion of those ions tend to be released during the during early snow melts. In producing what we call an early ionic pulse. And that is to do with a process called snow ion exclusion. And what happens is that during ice crystal formation, the ions tend to be excluded to the surface of the snow grains. They cannot be easily integrated into ice lattice. And so they tend to form this highly mobile quasi-liquid layers at the surface of the snow grains. And so they become highly mobile because they are at the surface, they are the first ones to melt, and so they tend to produce this ionic pulse. And there are a number of factors affecting the snow ion exclusion rates for each ion. So what I did here was to develop the model based on what we know about the science of this process, the snow ion exclusion. So basically we have the snow grain core the snow-grained surface, and then we have the liquid phase here in blue. So there's all these transfers of ions to the different layers. So that's what the model is doing. You can divide the snowpack in as many layers as necessary, and then have the solid phase. And the solid phase has two compartments, the core and then the snow-grained surface, and then the mobile phase, which moves through the snowpack. And I won't provide, won't give too many details on how this is done. You can see this in the paper. But we were quite successful with this, and we applied to different sites and for different anions and cations. There was an experiment in 1995 by Davies where he for the first time, he looked at snow concentrations in snowpacks during snow melt. And what he observed was that you can see here after 8 hours, there's a peak here. This is the depth of the snowpack. So there's an ion load front moving through the snowpack. It starts after 8 hours, after the start of the snow melt, then it moves all the way down and so on and so forth, as you can see here as well. At 0, 58 hours, and then 96. So the pulse has already exited the snowpack. And so that is a good insight into whether the model is performing well. And as you can see here, this is the simplified simulation. Then we went into more complex simulations, but this one is assuming a uniform snowpack concentration. So it's here. Then you have here the load front moving with the liquid phase as the wetting front moves through the snowpack, and this is just keeping track over time of those concentrations. So this one keeps track of this one keeps track of this one, and this is basically the profile. That basically is this these curves here. So you can see it reproduces those experiments from 1995 by Davies, and here in the bottom is what we observe that is discharged from the snowpack. This is a paper from Harrington, 1998, and so when it reaches the bottom of the snowpack, the ion load, you'll see the pulse, and this is meltwater. This is what is discharged from the snowpack. Okay, so just pushing a little bit further. So the model was quite successful in this initial test. Then we extended this to other sites and other anions and cations, and we've been collaborating as well with across the border. And so we are quite happy with this model. But this is, as I said before, is very process specific. Is to try to help us understand the dynamics within the snowpack that can lead to how meltwater is discharged from those snowpacks, and that is really the critical point for runoff concentrations. And this is comparing the model against observations within the snowpack. It's the first time this is done, so we are quite happy that the model can capture the overall early elution of those ions. So the dots are the observations, and in the back is the model. And for the different ions. Yeah, so this is currently under review. Well, I'll go through this quickly, but there were other questions that were raised during those studies, and one of them was the fact that snowpacks form a preferential flow as they melt. That is well known, as you can see here. And the question was what is the impact of this process in how meltwater removes those ions from the snowpack and for snow meltwater chemistry. And that is important because we know with climate change that the frequency of rain on snow events are likely to increase. So we might have an increase in this preferential flow dynamics. And we wanted to know what is really the impact of this. So we set up 2 experiments on preferential flow paths, or PFP, referring to preferential flow paths naturally formed, so just radiation convection, letting the snowpack melt naturally. And then the other one is the same process, radiation convection, but we also added rain on snow. And this is the experimental setup. This is a camera where we're capturing the preferential flow. using dye. And on the back here, we have the bottles F to F6, the bottles here, and there's basically an empty row here to avoid contamination from the dye put here into the bottles on the back. And the rain on snow is simulated using these burettes. Well, so this is the wetting front moving during snowmelt. So the ripening phase is about 5 hours. So that's how long it takes for the wetting front to move through the snowpack. This is a relatively shallow snowpack, 30. This is not meters actually. This is centimeters. You can see that with rain on snow, it's the red line. It moves always a little bit further, faster, and that is what we, of course, what we would expect. But you can see that, so this region here, the red region in this preferential flow, these are the bottles receiving preferential flow. Here you can see that, so you can see that each of these bottles 1 to 6 are these 1 to 6, and you can see the thin lines are snowpacks melting through radiation convection only, and the thick lines are radiation convection with rain on snow. And as you can see, there are thick and thin lines on both regions. So you see thick and thin lines here, thick and thin lines on this region as well. So this is preferential flow, this is matrix flow. So the key message here is that there's no need for rain on snow for preferential flow to form. It naturally happens in melting snowpacks. So this is just the hydrology. Now we're going to the chemistry. And the evidence is overwhelming. We can see that early preferential flow transports 95% of the ions for nitrate and 75% for phosphate. You can see here the red lines. And that represents 15% of the ions within the first 1% of melt. So this is a really overwhelming evidence that the ion exclusion is happening and really concentrates the ionic load in the first stages of snow melt. Although this is before the interaction with the soil can have a buffering effect on this ionic pulse. When we add the rain on snow, we were surprised to see that actually the amount of the load reduced. But we think that this is only because it was a very small, small intensity rain on snow event, and what happened was that this rain may have refroze within the snowpack and then just basically blocked lateral flow from delivering snow ions to the leading edge of preferential flow after refreezing. So that's why there was this decrease, and this is because there was a small intensity rain on snow event. Now this was interesting to understand the process, and now we're extending that pulse model to look into 2 dimensions and coupling with a model called SMPP for simulating capillary hysteresis effects on preferential flow. This is basically liquid phase, the liquid contents, meltwater concentrations for nitrate. I think this is actually microequivalent, and then snow nutrient concentration, then nitrate concentration in the snow. But this is still under development, but we have the data from the experiments. There are other studies on this model algorithm research theme, and this one is related to the effect of plant residue in terms of nutrient release. We know that plants over winter may undergo freeze and thaw, and that damages the cells, the plant cells, and they tend to leach nutrients. And that is related, has been related. The number of cycles of freeze and thaw cycles has been has a direct effect on the amount that has been released. So, based on that evidence and some experiments, I developed a model for simulating that contribution. So here is the snow, and with and the black is the snow, and the red is the snow with plant residue for both nitrate and phosphate. And this has also been published. And there's also been some work on looking at the effect of frozen soils and runoff soil interactions into nutrient release. And that is basically the winter model that is currently being extended. You can look into more details on some of these papers here. Okay, so now this brings me to the integrated mathematical models. And so there are these two distinguishing these two types, hydrological and hydrodynamic, although they can actually merge at some point. But so the idea is to developing new tools for enhanced farm or catchment scale quantity and quality predictions to support water resources management and the testing or evaluation of beneficial management practices. Yeah. And so as you remember that circular diagram that I showed in the first, I think the third slide or so, where I compared HYPE and a number of other models. So we identified a number of problems with the hydrology or missing processes. And that's the reason why I chose to use the CRIM, the Cold Regions Hydrological Modeling platform, because it's based on more than 50 years of research in Canadian hydrology, and it has modules to represent many of those processes that we identified as being neglected or overlooked in prominent catchment models. So we have, for example, here blowing snow, and this is an active research tool. The hydrology is in continuous improvement, so it's a good tool to couple the chemistry. And so we have components for modules for snow, for soil, and for routing. For snow, this is the model that has, I would say, the most advanced snow chemistry at these scales. We have atmospheric deposition, chemical accumulation, snow ion exclusion is an important piece, as I could show in some of those experiments, and then snow melt and transport. And then the soil component, we have biogeochemical cycling. This is pretty standard, actually. And nutrient mass balances, soluble and particulate, and organic and mineral. And we're focusing now on the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. And then we have the routing as well. So this is still under development as well. But we've been testing this on the South Tobacco Creek basin, particularly on a sub-basin called the Steppler basin that has been monitored and studied for since 2006, if I'm not mistaken. And this is a huge effort from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, as well as Environment and Climate Change Canada. And so I was very fortunate to have access to this data. They've been monitoring these sites in detail. So each of these numbers corresponds to field, and they have measurements for mineral, fertilizer, manure applications, tillage practices, crops planted, and so on and so forth. So that's really an ideal test site for testing the performance of this model. This is how this is conceptualized within the framework. So each of those fields correspond to an HRU. For those who don't know what an HRU is, many of these hydrological models divide the domain in hydrological response units, basically areas in the landscape that are thought to have a similar hydrological response. So they are lumped together. So we have each of these numbers here is the field. Within brackets, it's very small, you probably can't see, but between brackets you have HRU number, and so this is how it's routed, and we have a number of measurement sites here that we can validate the tool. Although, as I said before, this is still in the development, but I have some results for an early version based on the winter model that I presented previously. And we've been focusing here mainly on the snowmelt period, because we know that particularly in the prairies, spring snowmelt exports most of the nutrients exported annually. So this is really a critical period of the year, and it tends to be relatively flashy and we think that hourly temporal resolutions are critical to capture some of these processes. Unlike many of those models that I identified initially, their default setting tends to be daily, and that's how they tend to be evaluated against observations. So we are really focusing here on the hour resolution, and we achieved some success. Although Winter here is a very simplified version, but this is just to show you some of the progress we've done on some of these components. Another paper has been exploring that model and trying to look at the dominant controls of nitrogen and phosphorus export. So this is to try to support beneficial management practices. I can highlight some of these points. For example, here the snow peak concentrations, snow melt peak concentrations. We found that both observations in the model highlighted that for phosphorus, total dissolved phosphorus, the fertilizer used in the preceding fall was really the critical point for the magnitude of these peaks, but not so much for nitrogen. We found that the temperature, air temperature and precipitation over winter was really the dominant factor, and not so much the fertilizer used, and that was accumulated in the soil. There were other things such as overwinter biogeochemical cycling. We found that it happened, particularly for nitrates, and antecedent soil moisture conditions were a critical component of that. This is basically through mineralization, but for phosphorus, it tended to be fertilizer use tended to be the dominant control. And we also, it became evident that plant residue was an important source of phosphorus during the early stages of snowmelt as well. So now this takes me to a model called Fluxes, and this is an hydrodynamic model. We intend to couple this to an hydrological model, such as the Canadian hydrological model, a CHM, but the model at the moment is an hydrodynamic model only. And what I want to highlight here is that most hydrological models don't even use any of these. They tend to use very simplified routing schemes, such as the Muskingum scheme, and they don't really look into the balance, the momentum balance, or balance of momentum, or balance of forces. It's more or less the same thing. But if you look into river scale quality modeling, water quality models, they tend to use a kinematic wave, and that is basically saying that the wave only moves in one direction and doesn't bounce back. So it's basically using friction and gravity forces, and so it's neglecting inertial and pressure forces from the Navier-Stokes equation, and that is okay depending on the scale of the simulations. If you add the term for non-inertial wave, basically you considering for pressure, you tend to have the diffusion, what we call the diffusion wave. And what we explore here with Fluxes is another layer of complexity, but of detail as well, which is considering the inertial forces, what we call the dynamic wave. And that, I think, is very important, particularly in the prairies, because we have such a flat landscapes where we can have backwater effects. So the wave can, if it encounters an obstacle, may bounce back, and that is not captured by any of these simplifications. There is a cost associated with this. Of course, these models are more difficult to solve. They tend to, this model requires high performance computing, but we can have a level of detail and more information about the velocity fields and things like that are closer to reality, or at least in theory they should be, because we are taking into consideration the processes and the physics in more detail. And so this is an application again to the same basin, and the reason being that we have such an amazing data set here to test these models. This is a digital elevation model. And this is just a simulation to show the capabilities of the model. This is showing an hypothetical contaminant as it propagates through the system, and this is just flying over the terrain to see the model simulating. I think this is a 2011 snowmelt event in the region. So at the moment we are repurposing this to look at flooding snowmelt events, and with particular interest in flooding and how that affects the hydraulics and as well the nutrient dynamics and release from the soil to runoff. But that is so this is an application here comparing observations against the model for stream flow. We can see that it underestimates at the moment the peaks. But there are a number of reasons why this might be happening. We are using a digital elevation model, which is not perfect. Culverts have to be carved manually, and so there is some uncertainty there, and there is also the subgrid roughness that is somehow taken into account, but it's not resolved entirely. Although we are simulating this particular case at 3-meter resolution, so it's over about 1 million cells, and that's one of the reasons why this becomes quite computationally expensive. But then we can look at velocity fields. As you can see here, this is for the 2009 event, looking at the region close to the outlet, and you can see here the velocity fields and how the floodplains expand, and you can see as well preferential flow pathways that the water tends to take, and as well, of course, that will impact the transport of nutrients. This is looking at the different snowmelt events, and I have here 2009, 2011, and 2010 and 2011, and I have the numbers 1, 3, and 2, and this is just to say, so the number 1 represents to the year where there was the highest snowmelt intensity event, and then this is the second and the third. So this was a very small snowmelt event. So just we can see jumping from 1 to 2 and 3, you can see that velocity fields were tend to be a lot higher during this event, as you would expect. Is the high intensity event that with the highest snowmelt event that we simulated, and then you have this one here in 2011, and then 2010 was the lowest. And as you can see, some of these connections don't even connections from the headwaters to downstream don't even happen throughout the snowmelt event. This is just zooming in to look into the details. This can be quite helpful for water resources management and simulating scenarios of a change in the landscape and seeing how the velocity fields and flows might change with those landscape changes. So this is looking at average runoff velocity. This is still an ongoing work, but you can see that, of course, with a high intensity, this is 1 is the high intensity, 2nd and 3rd, the lowest intensity snowmelt event. Of course, the velocities, the average velocities across the domain tend to increase slightly when compared to the others. But you can see that it's not really a big difference. What we found is not necessarily the average velocity field within the domain, is more the wet areas increase substantially, and the depth of the water across the domain increases substantially. So the flows will increase substantially, not necessarily the average runoff velocities. This is an attempt to look into hydrological connectivity. As I said, this is still an ongoing work, but what we did here was to use a numerical tracer to look at the active cell hours. So each of these cells, we tracked the time that they were active throughout the different events. And you can see here for this event, we have this region, which is they were more active, and then the greens, and then the browns where there is very little activity throughout the event. So you can see that the regions with high active cell hours increase substantially with the high intensity snowmelt event, and decrease here, and then further decrease. As you can see, there's a transfer from the green high areas with green to high areas here with more brown. So regions that are not really well connected to the network, and sometimes never really connect. So you can see from 1 to 2, you still see the main river network or stream network connecting the upstream regions, although they tend to follow this line, and there's not much being fed from along the way, mostly coming from this region. There's lots of browns here. But when you go to low intensity snowmelt events, you see even more brownish, meaning that this is not really well connected. Now, looking at values across the domain, across the snowmelt event, so you can see I'm ordering this here from on a grayscale. The events, so 2009, the highest, and the intermediates, and then 2010 is the lowest snowmelt event. So let me highlight here, I think one of the most interesting results here is that the cumulative active hours of active hours in the domain, increased substantially here in this region when the main snowmelt event occurred in 2009. But then eventually, the event was very intense and stopped relatively short period of time. On the other hand, we have 2011, which is this line here, which was not so intense, but lasted for a much longer period of time. So in terms of number of cumulative active hours, we can see that it was not necessarily the event with the highest intensity, but with the highest duration that had the more active hours. And we're trying here to relate the contributing areas as a function of peak snowmelt rates. You can see it tends to have, as snowmelt rates increase, the contributing area will also increase, and also comparing that with total snowmelt. And here it's comparing the same thing, but in terms of total active hours, and comparing it with the duration of snowmelt and the total snowmelt volumes. Okay, now I'm reaching the end. So this is now looking. So until now we've been looking at the hydrology, at the hydraulics, and that can give us some insights on how we can better manage the system. But then looking at the transport of contaminants, what we have here is the predominant transport pathways for the different events. And what I would like to highlight here is that even for the high intensity events, there are regions here very close to the outlet that rarely connect to the streamline, to the main river network. So you can see here very clearly, and what this is telling us or suggesting is that all of these nutrients, they end up being connected here, being transported, and then they are discharged in particular locations, hotspots of discharge, which basically may bypass the riparian zone or buffer zones that have been implemented as a beneficial management practice. And so we might be overloading certain regions and underloading others. That has, of course, will have an impact on the efficiency of those beneficial management practices. So that is one of the, I would say, most interesting outcomes of this particular study, of this particular maps. So if there's a way to spread this discharge more evenly across the riparian zone, that could potentially increase the efficiency of nutrient removal. And this is looking again now across the entire domain, average values, and we see as well here the effect of duration in terms of biogeochemical connectivity. And I didn't explain how I calculated this, but this is just to give an indicator of how this worked. Okay, so finalizing, I'm reaching the end. So so I have this strategy here, and the idea is to always try to support decision support, nutrient management, and there's all of this work on lab and field scales, and that is just to have for us to have a better handle of the processes, separate them so we can understand them better, create better models. Sometimes they become too complex for large scale, so then we need to simplify them. But we need to have an in-depth understanding of those processes before we can simplify them. And this is where it comes the upscaling process for catchment or continental scales, can we say, and that is important for climate sensitivity and adaptation recommendations. Okay, so this is just to finalize, this is a session that we're going to propose CGU and is on breakthroughs in water quality modeling in cold regions. And so you are all invited to submit abstracts. It hasn't been submitted yet, but this is going to happen if they approve the session. So thank you, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Diogo. At this time, I'll allow the audience to type of questions and comments, and I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. But in the meantime, one thing that occurs to me is to what extent can the Tobacco Creek work be generalized? Do you have confidence that it's that your findings can be generally applicable, or are they basin applicable?
That's a good question. I think this was the South Tobacco Creek was used just for convenience for doing the model development, and that we are still working on that, right? I think we'll just have to test. I think the principles, because the models take into consideration the different processes in a physically based manner, in general terms. Of course, not all the processes are represented in lots of detail, but I think potentially they can be. I mean, CREAM is being applied across Canada, so I think the hydrology, the background is there. The biogeochemistry, the dynamics and pathways between the different pools, it's more or less, for the soils, more or less standard. And we know that we still have to do some changes for cold regions. So there is actually now our PhD student that will be working on that. So I would say that the CREAM, particularly for CREAM, what we are doing now is the first heavy lifting of the modules, and then they have to be tested further and improved as we go, and more sites and data become available.
Thank you. I don't see questions coming up. If you have any, by all means type, and you'll also notice that in your window you should see a specific reference to Diogo's work. There's a link there to a couple of places where you can look at his work further. I think, unless someone has a question, we'll call this, bring this to an end. And I'd like to thank you, Diogo, and also thank Environment and Climate Change Canada for making you available. And thanks everyone for attending today. There will be another webinar in December, and we're working on the date. We have to modify the date, so we'll keep people informed of that. But thank you everyone, and have a good day. So
thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks.